Bonjour à tous. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for being here in person in Geneva at the Club Suisse de la Presse. And also thank you to all of you to be online for this very interesting event this morning with Mr. Kelly Chibale, who is sitting next to me, who is here in Geneva, and he's the chairman and CEO of the H3D Foundation in South Africa. This morning we are going to speak about all the innovative medicines discoveries in Africa and show you how, in fact, Africa is taking the lead in several domains. I'm sure that you will be passionate by what Kelly Chibale is going to tell us, because himself is a passionate man. He loves what he does, and he is going to share that with us this morning. So before further ado, I'll ask Mr. Chibale to write a few words in our golden book, the one of the Club Suisse de la Presse, because it's an honor for us to have him here. You have to know that Mr. Chibale is not often in Geneva. That's the reason why it is really exceptional to have him here with us. And he writes in French. Thank you so much for this kind attention. So, Mr. Chibale, the floor is yours. Maybe you could tell us a little bit what the situation is for the moment, and what are the 3 priorities for you in what's happening for the moment on the African continent that has been hit also by the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Catherine, or shall I say merci beaucoup. So that's the only French that I know, that I can speak. Thank you for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to be here in Geneva. As you said correctly, I don't always come to Geneva, but when I do, I have a wonderful time. I am based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. This is the beautiful city of Cape Town. And in many ways, when I think about just reflecting on the pandemic, which I think that the Africa handled this pandemic extremely well. I think we had tremendous leadership from the Africa CDC, Centers for Disease Control. I think that they really provided continental leadership that was really critical in not only managing the pandemic in different countries, but also providing a unified voice for the continent in terms of approaching, for example, vaccine procurement and things like that. I think that's what I think COVID highlighted is this exceptional leadership, political leadership, but also leadership from the Africa CDC. But also, the pandemic also really, although clearly it shook the African health systems, and of course also emphasized the need for our continent to bolster the public health infrastructure and the capacity, but also really highlighted and emphasized the need for local innovation. And I think that it really also showcased the innovation potential that's available in the African continent. I think we saw South African scientists actually leading by example, not only identifying different variants of the virus, but doing the sequencing and informing the world, sharing, pathogen sharing. And that, I think, is something to be very proud of. So, really, to say this as my opening statement, Africa is primed for entrepreneurial progress in health innovation. I think what it just needs is an integrated health innovation ecosystem and robust investment in infrastructure and skills development.
Thank you for this introduction, and I would like to come back on what you just mentioned, the political leadership and also the leadership in the health domain in Africa. Is it due also to the fact that Africa had to deal with so many big outbreaks? We had different outbreaks of all kinds of diseases in the recent years, and maybe African people are more aware about the importance to follow the advices of doctors, but also the ministers of health, or when there's a political message about that?
Yeah, so you talk about outbreaks and experiences from different epidemics. I think the more recent one is really the Ebola outbreak, which really provided a blueprint of how Africa was able to respond, although it was obviously at the regional level. It wasn't the pandemic across the entire continent. It was epidemic confined to the western part of Africa. But I think we saw the infrastructure that was built on the Ebola pandemic, fighting the pandemic, and the infrastructure, but also a blueprint in terms of just the response from the private sector and partnering with governments to respond to that. So that infrastructure was actually really came in hand when it came to responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. What we also saw, which I think probably explains one of the reasons why the situation wasn't as it was predicted to be, was I think the compliance, I think, of the citizens. That I think the political messaging, the acknowledgement of the issue, and of course people really being compliant because of the systems that have been put in place previously when we have this kind of epidemics and people really follow the law and respond to the crisis as requested by our leadership.
So you spoke about also innovation. It is a fact that in Africa we see that every day for decades, that because of a lack of financial capacity, usually African people have incredible ideas to find solutions, cheap solutions with what they have. And we've seen, for instance, in the domain of washing hands, that was one of the tools that was used in order to fight against the pandemic COVID-19, that people had not always access to running water. So they found some really innovative ideas and ways to put water and soap and access to soap. So is that also a way to participate to also the protection of environment, something that we have tendency to forget here in Western countries where we have access to running water and to clean water, but also hygiene. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit about the importance of hygiene and also, as I just mentioned, the importance of access to clean water. That is one of the SDGs. Could you also elaborate about all these elements that have been highlighted during the beginning of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, on the African continent?
Yeah, so when the intervention of social distancing or physical distancing was obviously implemented across the nations and the countries around the world, the challenge for a place like Africa, we have what we call townships. In other places, they call them ghettos or slums. And it is practically impossible to social distance because people live in these crammed areas where it is simply impossible to do that. And so to expect them to comply with that kind of requirement is impractical. However, as you were saying earlier, the kinds of interventions that people would innovate around, so focusing on what they can do in their environment with what they have, I think is remarkable. And I think really underscores the need for local innovation to be incentivized and supported, because I think that we have to think about how we can harness these really innovative solutions that are homegrown, that people can come up with these innovative solutions, that things that people take for granted, maybe here in Geneva, access to running water, having, sanitizer or stuff like that. But I think those local solutions, charting homegrown solutions, are the kinds of things that we need to be incentivizing and encouraging more. It's not always about having the finances to do something, but I think it's the creativity, which problems often bring out in people. And Africans are very resilient people. And
also good lessons. I think that never we had the opportunity to see how the North can learn from the South.
Absolutely. This is always going to be about education. There's as much that we can learn from the global North as they can learn from us. And I think that the creativity, the challenges of how the African continent responded to this, the leadership at the political level, the leadership at the level of the Africa CDC, and the citizens in managing this, I think has provided, valuable lessons that the global North can learn from as well, from Africa.
And maybe you could elaborate a little bit on also the contribution in the scientific world in finding solutions, not only in the case of COVID-19, but also in the cases of other outbreaks, the scientific contribution of African scientists and doctors. That is something that we don't hear a lot about here.
Yeah, so starting with just the example of the COVID-19 pandemic, as I said earlier, we saw the innovation coming from African scientists in really sequencing and identifying new variants which they shared with the world. Again, showing this world-class infrastructure that is there to do surveillance, doing pathogen sequencing, but closer to discovering and developing new medicines is exactly the work of our center, known as the Holistic Drug Discovery and Development Center, H3D, which is based at the University of Cape Town. And this is not only the first and only center of its kind on the African continent, but it's also quite rare worldwide. If you look at just the kind of integrated infrastructure that has been set up, that we is now deploying into finding solutions for not just COVID-19 therapeutics, but also malaria, TB, and antimicrobial resistance. In fact, this year, H3D became a Johnson & Johnson satellite center for global health discovery, focusing on the discovery of precision antibiotics in combating the issue of antimicrobial resistance. And this is a very significant achievement and development, and I think it's a recognition of the capacity, the talent, the expertise, and the infrastructure that is available on the African continent, that a big healthcare pharmaceutical company like Johnson & Johnson can actually establish a satellite center at H3D, which is only one of the 3 globally.
So I would like you to tell us a little bit more, in a few words, about that H3D center. For the audience who is here with us, but also the people that are online, everybody does not know what it is about, when was it created, why, what are the goals, the main goals, the targets, and how you work and you collaborate. You have maybe partnerships with the pharma and other innovative partnerships.
Yeah, so H3D was founded in 2010. So we have been going for the last 12 years. It is a world-class integrated drug discovery center that has really been pioneering the discovery of medicines. Not just the discovery of medicines, H3D has also been focused on developing tools that will allow the deployment from the perspective of improving treatment outcomes in African patients. So we are really, really focused on how we can improve treatment outcomes in African patients for a variety of reasons, including the very low volume of clinical trials that happen on the continent, but also the lack of tools that will allow us to prioritize therapeutics as we develop them based upon their predicted profile of how they're going to perform in African patients. But the model of how H3D has been built is really a model around partnerships. So these are research and funding partnerships involving academia, which is our University of Cape Town, and many other academic institutions in Africa and globally. Secondly, the pharmaceutical industry has been a major contributor to the growth and development of H3D. We have had tremendous partnerships with Novartis. For example, this year, 2022, is actually the 10 years of collaboration with Novartis, which has involved several elements, including funding to develop the center, has come from Novartis, scientific exchange programs, helping us with governance, volunteering members of our scientific advisory board coming from Novartis. We also have similar partnerships with Johnson & Johnson, Janssen Pharmaceuticals, which initially started as capacity building relationship, where we would identify gaps that we have in Cape Town. And then we partner with Johnson & Johnson and Novartis and companies like that to address those gaps. We've also had partnership with Merck KGaA. So this is the European Merck, which of course is a very important distinction, because there's also the North American Merck, MSD, which we have also partnered with over the years. So tremendous partnerships with the pharmaceutical industries and also product development partners. An example of this is the Medicines for Malaria Venture, MMV, based right here in Geneva. But finally, but not least, are two other very important partnerships. One with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been a very, very important partnership, especially coupled to the partnership with the government of South Africa. Everything that we've done would not have been possible if it wasn't for South African government support, which has been foundational to the development of the infrastructure, and also providing leverage funding. So for example, for every dollar we get from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we get $1 from the government of South Africa through the various funding mechanisms. So this has really allowed H3D to develop world-class infrastructure. We've had successes already. We discovered and developed a drug with our partners which entered into clinical trials in patients up to phase 2. This is a drug for malaria. And we've had a pipeline of other potential candidates that we are developing for TB and antimicrobial resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll have an event on AMR next week here in the Club Suisse, so we know that it is something very important. You just spoke about the collaboration, the cooperation with the pharma industry, and talking about pharma industry, we also talk about, of course, medicines and the African Medicines Agency that started its, I would say, way to harmonize the different, harmonize and facilitate the different medical regulations through Africa. It started in 2009, if I'm not wrong, and now they got the number of countries that ratified it. So that is also, I think, a sign that Africa wants to reach a better harmonization of its health policies.
Yeah, so I think the development of the African Medicines Agency, I think, really symbolizes a very significant step in the continent really getting together to really remove the barriers to, not only barriers to innovation, but also barriers to local manufacturing. So we saw during the COVID pandemic the importance of not just fostering local innovation, but also local manufacturing. But the real barrier is the lack of harmonization across the continent, which not only makes it difficult to really boost local manufacturing, but also it undermines efforts to do regional integration to be able to respond to a pandemic like COVID. You can get access to vaccines, but if you don't have an efficient regulatory system or ecosystem, then of course that would really affect access to the vaccine or therapeutics. So this is a significant development, but also especially given one of the big challenges on our continent, this issue of fake medicines and substandard medicines, which are very difficult to deal with when it's only focused on a single country. And so what this African Medicines Agency, I think, will facilitate the fighting of these fake medicines and substandard medicines, because then countries will be able to share the data, can cooperate with surveillance and stuff like that. And so this is a significant step forward in harmonizing the environment.
We know that it's a huge problem, fake medicines. One of the leaders to fight that is the president of Benin, President Talon, and of course we have IFPMA that did organize several campaigns to, in fact, I'm looking for the word, finding ways to inform people about the danger of fake medicines. And it is something that now we start to see also in the global north. It is not only the global south that is a victim of that. You mentioned also a few minutes ago about local manufacturing. So maybe it would be interesting to tell us a little bit more on that. We've seen with COVID-19, in fact, some people discovered with COVID-19 that you had countries and regions, countries like India, that was, in fact, that is and was the main manufacturer in the world of vaccines, that there were a lot of deals signed already between the global north and other countries. And they discovered also that Africa is also a manufacturing continent and has the capacity to do so. And could you tell us about the actual capacity, the capacity that you are trying to build also through the H3D Center, and how you see the future?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic, we keep referring to the pandemic, I think it just highlights one fundamental risk. If there is over-dependence or over-reliance on, let's say, India manufacturing for most of Africa, and I really need to make this point very clear. So there are two aspects to manufacturing. One is manufacturing the active pharmaceutical ingredient. The other aspect is formulation. Unfortunately, most of the manufacture of the active pharmaceutical ingredients has largely happened outside of Africa. There's a huge component of formulation that happens on the ground. Now, when there are supply chain issues, if India, as any country ought to do, prioritizes its citizens first, we are going to have a real problem in Africa. So I think that we have to have the kind of policies, government policies, that incentivize and deliberately prioritize local manufacturing. You see, you can have local manufacturing, but if there isn't a government policy to incentivize local manufacturers or prioritize them, then of course it defeats the whole purpose. So I think we have to couple this with the right policies that incentivize local manufacturing, but also local demand. There has to be local demand. So I think that it's not just something we can think about blaming external factors, but it's also understanding that we also have a mutual responsibility to make sure that locally there's demand for locally produced products, because it is so significant for our health security.
But it's also a question of confidence, because in order for the people to request local manufacturing, they need to have confidence in what is manufactured on the continent. And is there a possibility of win-win relations with the global north in that specific domain?
Absolutely. And I think what you saw during the pandemic is I do not think that African countries were begging for or asking multinationals to come and build plants. They were asking for technology transfer to facilitate their own construction of the manufacturing facilities. So we need this cooperation with multinational pharma companies. But then, of course, it's really important that we respect intellectual property. Technology transfer happens when there is trust. When there is trust for the innovators who pass on the technology to the end user, that they must have confidence in respect for the rule of law, respect for intellectual property, because that is what fosters innovation. It creates an environment where innovation flourishes. It incentivizes innovators to do more. So I think it's a mutual relationship and a mutual responsibility. On one hand, people are open to receiving technology, but it's also incumbent upon ourselves in Africa to ensure that there is respect for intellectual property, that we not only respect intellectual property, but we honor it. IP is just as important to me as a local innovator as it is to a multinational. So this is not an issue about IP for pharmaceutical companies. It's IP for innovators.
But innovation means also you need money. And you just mentioned that your center, H3D, has been able to grow because of the government also of South Africa, the strong political will to accompany you in this development. Do you think that it is easy for other countries to follow that example? As we know that Africa has the intellectual capacity and the innovation and the innovative tools, but the problem is that most of the scientists that are finding innovating tools are not followed by the local, not only governments, their own governments, but also the local contributors or donors. They have always to leave the continent and work in the north, in huge, well-known companies, and in fact contribute in the global north to innovative solutions that sometimes they found living in Africa. So what are the solutions? Are there solutions? And are things changing?
Yes, so I think there are two main questions from what you just asked me. So the first one is the example of the government of South Africa. South Africa is arguably the most unequal society. You only have to come to the country to see the inequality that exists between the vast majority of the black population and the rest. Now, for the government of South Africa to prioritize making investments in research and development, for example, the support that we receive at H3D, I think is a tremendous example of actually understanding the business side of science. So even before you see the innovation, before you see the product developed, science or research and development creates jobs. It creates career opportunities for young people. It helps us halt the brain drain. So one of the reasons for the brain drain, if you look at many African countries after independence, have been training their citizens, and I think tremendous progress has been made. But the problem is the ability to retain that talent on the continent. And in fact, I keep saying, African science is not dead. It's alive, but living in Europe and North America. And the principal reason for that is that we do not have, on a large scale, an absorptive capacity, that capacity to be able to attract talent, develop it, nurture it, and return it on the continent. So the example that we've done at H3D is just an example of what is possible. Through these networks of partnership with government, the pharmaceutical companies, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we've grown the center from 5 people when we started to about 80 people. 85% of those have PhDs and masters. And those are direct jobs. These are direct jobs. So one of the reasons that our government supports us strongly, I think we've shown the business case, which is that research and development, even before you see a product or a solution, it creates jobs. It builds infrastructure. Therefore, to halt this brain drain, stop talent leaving the continent, is we have to create jobs. There's no two ways about it. So that that talent can contribute solutions in Africa. But it's our responsibility, together with government and everyone, it's not just politicians, it's all of us, leadership at multiple levels.
So, in the partnerships, what kind of innovative partnerships did you create? You have classic ones. You mentioned some with the pharma, with the government is something exceptional to have such a government that is following you from A to Z and still following you. But are you having or signing partnerships with other continents? Not only the Global North, because we spoke about the Global North, but Asia, Latin America, the Arab countries.
So first of all, we have a saying, I wish I could say it in French, but it says, charity begins at home. So this is what we have been doing. So H3D, we've been going for the last 12 years. What we started doing in about 2017, 2018, is to begin to expand the ecosystem and community in Africa. So that based on the lessons that we've learned, whether it's government support, whether it's partnerships with the pharmaceutical companies, the partnership with the IFPMA right now that we have is really about scaling up on all the capacity building initiatives that we initiated at H3D so that we can expand the community and ecosystem across the continent of Africa. And I'm very proud to say that we've done an amazing job with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through a program known as the Grand Challenges Africa Drug Discovery Program. And this is precisely an initiative and a mechanism to begin to have these partnerships beyond the borders of South Africa with our brothers and our sisters and our colleagues from other parts of Africa, based on the model that H3D used to grow and develop, which is a project-based approach. In other words, we focus on getting the research done, achieving results that then scale up and attract even more success. And I think that's exactly what we're doing. We have a network of partners around Africa, from West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, but all working towards a common goal on joint projects with partners from the pharmaceutical industry supporting those groups, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation providing funding, Medicines for Malaria Venture also contributing to that effort as well. And we also have within the BRICS countries, we have collaborations with colleagues in Brazil and India. So it's really an ecosystem, but we've got to do this first in Africa because charity begins at home.
You're right. About those research programs, which on which field is it? Is it malaria? Is it HIV? Is it, okay, we know that when you have HIV, you have a lot of TB. Is it on other diseases or non-communicable diseases? Are you also looking into that? Because we know that Africa is hit also by a high rate of non-communicable diseases now, something that we didn't thought about.
Well, you know, there's been greater political focus on infectious disease, but the non-communicable diseases actually are the silent killers, because, you know, everyone is, you know, it's a lifestyle, and I think that what we have focused on, remember, we haven't had a history of doing drug discovery. Even the history of H3D is very recent, just 12 years in the game. So what we're beginning to do is again, through this program that I mentioned now with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Grand Challenges, is starting with building the critical infrastructure. It is so important because when I talk about infrastructure, by the way, this is more than a physical building. It's systems. For example, procurement of reagents. We saw this even COVID. You know, we can't even, you know, easily procure chemicals. When you're in Europe, you can order chemicals tomorrow, you get them. In Africa, it's not like that. So I think that to really make a business case, to benefit from the economies of scale, we have to expand the activities across the continent so that it makes business sense for companies that sell reagents and chemicals to set up shop on the continent. And I think that is the beginning, is that we have to start with building the critical infrastructure, building the technology platforms, and really a critical mass of skilled scientists. And that takes time. It takes experience. And so what we're beginning to see is just the beginning of a journey. But the hope and the dream is that we're going to have technologies and infrastructure we can deploy to any disease. But the current focus, you need focus. You need to do something that you can demonstrate you can do it before you begin to expand. So the focus has been on malaria, TB, and antimicrobial resistance. And those are really being used as vehicles to develop the critical infrastructure and the ecosystem for people to know, to learn about how we discover medicines, working with the pharmaceutical companies and working with the IFPMA in a very important program to really develop the skills that we need, not only for drug discovery, but also for local manufacturers. We need to develop scientific leaders. This is so critical. Leadership is so important. It's not just political leadership. It's scientific leadership as well. And that's what we focused on with the IFPMA, to really scale up on these initiatives to develop the skills that we will need.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the fact that we needed to expand the economy first through the continent. Have you created a global African platform to identify all the African scientists that are still working in Africa? Because we know that some exceptional African scientists are not working anymore in Africa. You mentioned at the beginning of this exchange about the incredible leadership we got during the beginning of the pandemic by Africa CDC and Dr. John Nkengasong, very well known, brilliant, exceptional. I mean, he left. He is now heading a very important US program. So as you mentioned, we like to keep also some exceptional people on the continent. But coming back to my question, do you have a platform that is in fact gathering all the African scientists also to exchange views and good practices? Does it exist? Because there's a gap between the French-speaking Africa and the English-speaking Africa, and I'm not even mentioning the part that is working in Arabic or in Portuguese.
So Thank you. Those are really great questions, and I think tremendous credit to John, the former director of CDC, exceptional leader, inspirational leader. Coming back to your question around the diaspora. So first of all, by the way, even in Europe, Europe is not homogeneous. So what do you need to have that can bring or foster unity? It's a project. So the example that I gave you of the grand challenges, so we have researchers, for example, in West Africa, in Mali, working together with researchers in South Africa and Kenya around a common project, each contributing to that project from their home institution. Now, these barriers, language barriers, are not easy to break, but when you have a common project, science has got only one language. There's only the language of science. And what you're beginning to see is exactly this ecosystem of a network of research partners, which we have put together through these grand challenges Africa Drug Discovery Program that is being supported very generously by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we're beginning now, we're at a phase where we've selected about a total of 16 initial investigators from all across Africa. We are now moving to scaling up on this so that we can bring in additional researchers across Africa. But what brings them together is this network of research partners around the same project. And when you talk about the diaspora, by the way, I think that this is exactly, for me, I don't think it matters where one is. So what I mean by patriotism, patriotism doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in your home country. It's what you do for your country, wherever you are. And if you are in a position to help your country because you're in a better position, you can do that. I come from Zambia originally. I have been able to do more for my country by being outside, to be in a place where I have the ability to do so. It doesn't mean that we can't build local capacity. That's exactly what we're working to do. So for people in the diaspora, for them to come back, we have to make it attractive. We have to, first of all, start by focusing on highlighting the people that are on the ground. See, we like bemoaning the lack of scientists. We like to say, oh, everybody's migrating to North America and Europe. But we don't focus on supporting the people who have not left, who have remained on the continent. Support them well to succeed, because when they succeed, it's going to encourage people to say, you know what, you can do it at home as well. You don't have to leave. But unless we have enough examples of highlighting successful individuals and highlighting them, shining a spotlight on them, it's going to encourage people who are in the diaspora to even consider coming back. But if all they see of their colleagues and friends who went back to Africa, they are struggling. Why should they come back? So we have to be realistic about it. But I think that there's a role for people in the diaspora. They don't have to physically come back. They can contribute from where they are. But we have to make it attractive for people in the first place not to leave. And that is to focus on supporting the people who have not left and supporting them to succeed, not to survive.
You mentioned exceptional doctors and researchers in Mali. Yes, I mean, in Mali, in Côte d'Ivoire, in DRC, name it. I mean, there's so many exceptional people working in the field and finding also innovative tools, because they don't have access to the classic tools that they would have in the global north. I'd like to ask you another question also about the fact that the H3D is based in South Africa. Do you think that it would be interesting to open another H3D, let's say, in West Africa, as I mentioned at the beginning, because West Africa, Dakar, Senegal, Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, or any French-speaking city, that side, in order also for the doctors and the researcher to have a better capacity of exchange. We know that there's so many documents. You mentioned about the fact that Europe is very diverse, but that's the reason why most of people use a very broken English to communicate in Europe, because everybody has its own language. And we know that most of the scientific publications are in English. And it takes time to translate it in Portuguese or French when it's translated, and often it's too late because innovation goes so quickly. So do you plan to open another satellite in Africa?
Yeah. Much more than an H3D as in a H3D satellite in another part of Africa, is actually a very exciting development that I'd like to share now, precisely to answer this question. There is a Ghana, West Africa drug discovery hub that has been funded from this year very generously by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to work towards replicating what H3D has done. And we have partnered with the Ghana hub. Richard Ameu, Dr. Richard Ameu is one of my colleagues that I work with, who is leading that effort along with other groups around the Noguchi Institute in Ghana. As an example of how when there's an ecosystem of researchers in one region, just like before we even dream about the African Medicines Agency, there has already been regional harmonization. There's been harmonization at the regional level. An example is this Zazibona, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia. The regulators in that region get together. So when it comes to an H3D equivalent, at a regional level, we're beginning to see this ecosystem starting to happen in Ghana. But also remember, regions and countries have to focus on an aspect of health innovation which they can do in their own environment. Because health innovation is not just about, discovery of drugs. The groups in Mali, for example, that we are working with, their expertise is in malaria biology, the biology, looking at specific strains of the parasite, which you can only find in that part of the region. So the collaboration with them is based on complementary expertise. So we don't necessarily have to duplicate everything, because even H3D, when we started, we only had one platform. We didn't have everything. So we had to rely on our partners to fill the gaps that we had, because we didn't have to set up everything. But with time, then we built all the critical infrastructure in one location.
So next one will be in Central Africa.
Absolutely. We're just going to develop the scientific leaders, because without leadership, you cannot have centers emerge, but also institutional leadership. Universities being able to support these research leaders, because without that foundation, this is what we had at the University of Cape Town. It was very strong leadership at the University of Cape Town that provided the institutional support, which was augmented by support from the government of the Republic of South Africa. So, whether it's for Central Africa, the challenge is for the leaders of those institutions to create an environment for the people to flourish, to remove barriers that hold back innovation in those institutions. That's a model. First, leadership. Second, infrastructure. Third, a globally aligned project so that you can have partners based on mutual interest, as we have done with the pharmaceutical companies, which means we then take responsibility as well.
So to end on that, what would be your wish for 2023?
My wish for 2023 is significant partnerships, more partnerships, not just with IFPMM, individual pharmaceutical companies, so that we can increase investments in science. Number two, in skills development and robust infrastructure, so we can keep the talent we develop in Africa, for Africa. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Kelly Chibale, d'avoir été avec nous, for being with us. Thank you to all of you being in the room here in Geneva at the Club Suisse de la Presse and being online. See you next time and have a nice afternoon.